All right, we are live for our 3 o'clock live stream for Saturday. And give just a moment for people to join here, and once you are in, just let me know if you can see and hear okay. It's a little windy up here on the bluff this morning, or this afternoon. Getting these afternoon winds going on, but we are going to be going inside today, so hopefully that'll help out with the winds. Just going to give a moment for people to join here. All right, I see our first little person popping up. If you're here and you can see and hear okay, can you send me a little comment, and I will go ahead and pop a comment in here as well. All right. So I'm at Fort Humboldt State Historic Park today. Flip this around. My name is Kyle. I'm a Park Interpretive Specialist with California State Parks, and as I said, we're at Fort Humboldt State Historic Park today. This is on the far north coast of California, smack dab in the middle of the city of Eureka, one of the largest cities up here on the north coast. So I'm seeing some likes coming in, so hopefully that means you can see and hear okay. Yes, I can hear you just fine. I can't hear you just fine. I hope that is an autocorrect issue. Anyway, here we are, and what we're going to be talking about today is the Fort Humboldt Hospital. So this building right here, last week we did a little exploration of the surgeon's quarters right across from the field from me today. Those are the surgeon's quarters. We checked those out last week, so if you missed that, go check out our live stream, or 2 weeks ago, we went a little live tour of that building. So today we're going to flip it around and do a little live tour of this building right here. So this is the hospital building here at Fort Humboldt. This is said to be one of the only original building still standing. So while every piece of wood potentially has been replaced on this building, it still stands, or is said to be standing, in its original location. And I've had a lot of questions about this ladder on the roof before, and we think that was for chimney sweeps. There's a lot of rain up here on the north coast, and the roofs can get very slippery, so for chimney sweeps to be able to sweep out the chimney and be using it in the fire, they need to get up there on a wet roof. Really quick, while we are still out here, I wanted to point out just this we have a really beautiful garden over here on the side. It is a little windy. I'm trying my best to cover the mic with my hand, but we are going to be going inside shortly, so hopefully the wind will not follow us inside. So we have a beautiful garden over here. This was created by the soldiers early on at Fort Humboldt because this post was so isolated, and they had a desire for kind of fresh herbs and things like that. Early on, all of the supplies for this fort were being shipped up from San Francisco, and taking a long time to get here, and maybe not the freshest stuff. So the soldiers at Fort Humboldt, and potentially even started by Ulysses S. Grant, worked together to make a garden similar to this one. So this has been recreated with some of the herbs that may have been used during that time, some medicinal and some just for tasty food. All right, let's go ahead and go inside and get out of this wind here. So this is the hospital building, said to be the only building still standing here at Fort Humboldt. And for those who have never joined us here at Fort Humboldt before, Fort Humboldt was established in 1853. You might be wondering why there's a military fort up here on the far north coast of California where there's no formal wars or anything like that. And the reason is that this fort was created with the intention to mitigate the conflict between the indigenous people who were living in this area. I am on ancestral Wiyot land today, but a lot of different tribes in this area were affected by the events around Fort Humboldt. So this place was created to mitigate the conflict that was going on, as many European Americans were coming up to this area to look for gold and to get involved in the timber industry, and the indigenous people who were already living up in this area. So the military was sent to mitigate that conflict and to find some sort of solution. So today I want to explore this hospital building with you guys. So this building is going to be renovated relatively soon. So what you're seeing today may not be here when you are able to return and visit to this place. So for that reason, I feel like it's even more important to take this opportunity to show you guys around this really, really interesting place. So this building was not created, it was built as the fort was being built. When the soldiers first came up to Fort Humboldt, there was nothing up here on this bluff, and it was their job to kind of establish this outpost to help to mitigate these conflicts. They realized that this conflict was really, really complicated, and instead of actually going out and helping solve a lot of the conflicts or the fighting that was going on, the soldiers built up the fort as kind of a sanctuary where people could come and get aid if they were involved in any sort of conflicts and things like that. So the hospital building played a pretty central role to that, and Fort Humboldt being this outpost in this kind of isolated far north coast area, it played a really central role for the community. So this hospital was not just a hospital for soldiers. This was a hospital for any of the indigenous people in the area who might be seeking aid. This was a hospital for anyone living in the area. This hospital was a place of aid for people who were involved in the timber industry, people who were hunters, who were getting attacked by grizzly bears and things like that. This hospital served everyone in this community, not just the soldiers who were serving at Fort Humboldt. So for that reason, it was a really, really important place. All right, let's start to check out these rooms. So this first room I've kind of been circling around in here talks a lot about the indigenous experience in this area. Talks about some of their culture and life ways. There's a lot you can learn about this. Skip Lowry is of Yurok heritage and does programs every Sunday talking about his heritage and his culture. So if you guys want to learn more about that, I recommend checking out his programs, or Maya and Princess. They're usually on Wednesdays, talking about their Yurok culture as well. I'm not the person to talk a lot about their culture, but they are. So check them out. They've got lots of great talks. We've got lots of stuff archived, but they're live every other Wednesday and every single Sunday. So one thing I want to draw your attention to in this room that I think is really cool is we have this diorama of the fort. This is kind of in its prime. There's around 14 buildings here at the fort, and up to 90 soldiers could be stationed here. So you can see the way that the buildings were kind of laid out around the fort. We were outside earlier taking a look at the fort grounds, and a lot of these buildings are not still standing here today. And again, I'll say it, that this hospital building that I'm standing in is said to be the only original building still standing. And the reason that I say was said to be is because early on, when Fort Humboldt was acquired, during early archaeological digs to try and find foundations of some of the original buildings, they found another foundation that they thought may have been the hospital building. So it's possible that this was another building that was preserved by the people who owned this property before it passed over to the city and to the government, and that they renovated some other old building and called it the hospital building, and that this may not be the same building as the original hospital building, but is old and said to be original. So this next room here talks a little bit more about the kind of medicine and hospitalization at that time. So this bed right here is pretty similar to what a lot of the beds may have looked like, and there would be a lot more than one. There would be rows and rows of these beds in open rooms just to put people in. So I have this nice little quote right here, or a little excerpt that I'll read for you guys. It talks a little bit about this. So it says, if you were a soldier, a civilian, or a Native American anywhere in the Humboldt Bay region, you may have been assigned to this bed, one of many, in this hospital ward. You would have been attended by an army surgeon or a hospital steward, and you were assigned to Fort Humboldt. The typical surgeon had to be prepared for anything. They had to deal with a variety of diseases, from gunshot wounds to bear bites, and common causes of death were tuberculosis, liver, and heart disease at that time. And while I'm looking around in here, you guys, if you'd like to take a look at anything a little closer, if you have any questions about anything, please just let me know. I am your guide today. I'll take you wherever you want to be. We also have a nice little news clipping excerpt here from a successful amputation that was performed early on at Fort Humboldt. Somebody who had a tumor in their hand, their lower forearm was successfully amputated, which was not exceptionally common during those times to have a successful amputation. We also have this little dog tent right here. So this little tent right here, when the soldiers first came up to Fort Humboldt, there wasn't any buildings here. They had to start to establish the Fort Humboldt and actually build up those buildings. So tents like this one are what they lived out of for quite some time. And up here on the North Coast, it's very, very rainy. It's very wet. We have some of the highest rainfall in all of California. And so the soldiers who came up here in February, which is some of the rainiest months of the year. So they were sleeping on the ground out on those fort grounds in little tents just like this one. And you could have up to 3 people sharing a tiny little tent like this one. This excerpt right here in front of it, too, talks about how these tents were also used for surgery during those times as buildings were being built. It says, in the 1850s, tents like this one would be put out in the open and served sick as temporary hospitals before this building was built in 1863. Surgeons would use whatever furniture was on hand and administer the limited drugs of the day. Chloroform or strong whiskey was used to render the patient unconscious. As you can imagine, many did not survive the ordeal. I see Linda Cooper commenting, pup tent. They may be called pup tents as well. I've heard of them referred to as dog tents, but that's not too much of a stretch to call it a pup tent. I'll take it. I just think that is just really interesting to think about how far medicine has come. You know, in these times around 1850s, 1860s, the chief, drug that they would use to numb you up was either chloroform or whiskey. Like, that's all they had. So our modern medicine has come so far in making these operations successful, and just modern medicine is so advanced. So I have a nice display case here with some of the kind of tools that were used for surgery. We've got some bullet casings that have been removed, some old surgical equipment. And I know and some leeches. Leeches were also fairly commonly used in the medicine at that time. Diagrams for bone cuts, things like that. Got to look it up in a book, no looking it up on the internet. Here's the surgical kit. Let's see if I can get you a better view of that. Some of the early surgical tools. Pretty much just a bunch of sharp sawing things for doing surgery and some tourniquets to stop you from bleeding out. Definitely not as pleasant of an experience as being in a hospital now. This does also have just a nice little piece that talks about okay, looks like we got back. That's strange. Standing right next to our wireless connecting thing, so I'm very surprised that our connectivity is not 110% in here. My little router booster is literally right next to me. So unfortunately, it looks like we disconnected there for a little bit. Let's go back to where we were, and hopefully we will stay nice and clear. Sorry about that little delay, guys. So this next room starts to talk about some of the conflicts that you had between the indigenous groups up here and those early settlers, or early colonizers and European Americans. As they came in, there was this big kind of tug of war for resources. That indigenous people had all this land that they'd been living on, and you had people coming in who were kind of money thirsty and looking for resources to make money off of. Gold was a big driving factor up here at first, but pretty quickly people realized that the real value up here was in the redwood trees. The tallest trees in the world, these absolutely massive trees, was said that you could build 22 houses out of one single redwood tree. So you can imagine the kind of value that would be in one of those trees. And with indigenous people living on all this land, these early European Americans coming to this area came in and kind of pushed these indigenous people off of their land in order to access these resources. As you can imagine, people are not always happy to leave their ancestral homelands. And so there was a lot of fighting, and that's what kind of created this need for Fort Humboldt to be established. The soldiers. The Civil War kind of came in halfway through this conflict, and it was still an ongoing issue when the soldiers who were serving here were kind of called away to serve in the Civil War. And so their places were taken over by a militia that was made up of the civilians who were living in this area. This room here talks a little bit more about the conflict, and this big news article here talks about a particular massacre that happened at Tuluwat Island, or Indian Island, in this area. It was a pretty gruesome massacre that happened in the middle of the night on a peaceful ceremony, and was carried out as a part of a coordinated attacks against a variety of indigenous villages. And there was a journalist who was up here who started writing about some of the things that had happened. I believe his name was Bret Hart. And he wrote this article and was looking to get it published, and he was met with such disdain by the locals here for writing such an article about how terrible these things were that he was actually chased out of town and had to go down to San Francisco to get his article published. Also, just interestingly enough, having an Howitzer cannon in here, just old Civil War relics and stuff of that time. So while a cannon was likely never used here at Fort Humboldt because there wasn't really conflict of those times, there was a howitzer cannon here, even if it wasn't used. Last room here talks about this thing called the corral that was established here at Fort Humboldt. This was one of the acts taken by that militia that came to take over the fort as the soldiers went away to serve in the Civil War. So as those soldiers moved away to serve in the Civil War, this militia made up of the civilians that were living in this area kind of took over ownership of the fort. And they created what was called the corral as a way of protecting the indigenous people, or what they claimed to be a way of protecting the indigenous people. They brought around 800 people to the fort, kept them in a confine redwood stockade where they were not allowed to leave. And they were kept in terrible conditions. And unfortunately, many people died while they were in this captivity. But the corral was taken apart a few months after it was created, complained by a surgeon who was still serving here. And the remaining indigenous people were relocated to reservations. And with that militia that was serving here kind of considered their job done, because having moved the indigenous people to reservations, they were no longer on their ancestral land and no longer living where there were those valuable resources. There's so much to learn from the story here at Fort Humboldt, and I'm only touching on little pieces of it. Mostly I just wanted to give you guys a chance to look around this space here today. I'm kind of brushing over all of these exhibits, but if you do want to read more or read some of these exhibits, you can always just pause this video and take a little bit more time with some of these things. But I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of see the inside of the space. I think this is a beautifully curated kind of museum space, although some of the exhibits are a little bit out of date. So this area, this whole building is getting kind of a refurbishing. At some point, the inside of all these exhibits is going to be a little bit different. We'll have a lot of updated displays. So when the space is back open again and you are able to visit, really encourage you to come on over to Fort Humboldt, check out our brand new hospital building once it's been renovated, and see how different it looks from what it looks like here today. Thank you guys all so much for whoever has joined so far. I really appreciate you guys all being here. If you do have any questions about anything we've talked about or anything we've seen, go ahead and just pop a comment in there, and I will always come back around and answer those questions that you might have. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Don't forget to check out our Facebook Live programs as they're happening. We're going kind of every other day right now. Next week, that's going to shift up a little bit, but we'll tell you more about that on our Facebook page. Stay tuned for lots of new content and great stuff coming from us all the time. Thanks, everyone, for being here. We'll see you next time.